She had everything, and none of it was hers. Victorian England ran on a system most people never questioned, not because it was hidden, but because it was dressed in silk and called tradition. Lawyers drafted the documents, trustees signed the agreements, fathers arranged the meetings. Every piece of the machine worked perfectly to do one thing: transfer a woman's fortune into a man's hands the moment she said yes. The heiress didn't lose her money in a crash. She didn't lose it in a war. She lost it on a Tuesday afternoon in a church, in front of witnesses, while everyone applauded. Trustees managed her estate. Guardians approved her decisions. Etiquette controlled her movements. If she refused, she became a social catastrophe. If she accepted, she became legally invisible. The same status as a child, a criminal, or a lunatic. Those were the actual categories the law used. She couldn't sign contracts, couldn't keep her own earnings, couldn't leave without surrendering her children. The wealth stayed. She disappeared. This is what it looked like to be a Victorian heiress, and exactly why you wouldn't have survived it for a single week. If stories like this one, where privilege turns out to be a more elegant form of captivity, make you stop and think, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? To understand how any of this was possible, we need to go back, not just to the laws, but to the world that made those laws feel perfectly reasonable. England in the 19th century was not simply a country. It was a project, a decades-long, carefully maintained belief that civilization had finally found its correct shape. And that shape was hierarchical, masculine, and built on property. The Victorian era, stretching from Queen Victoria's coronation in 1837 to her death in 1901, was one of the most prosperous periods any empire had ever manufactured. Cotton mills thundered across the north. Railways cut through the countryside like veins of iron. London swelled into the largest city on earth, its streets choking with coal smoke, horse dung, and ambition. Fortunes that would have been unimaginable a century earlier were now being assembled in a single generation, passed down through wills thick with legal language and protected by institutions that treated wealth the way other cultures treated sacred objects, with ritual secrecy and absolute gravity. But the prosperity was not evenly distributed, not even close. The Victorian class system was not a ladder, it was a series of sealed chambers. You were born into one, and the mechanisms that held you there were not always visible. For men, the rules were brutal but navigable. For women, particularly women of property, they were something else entirely. Something that required an entirely different vocabulary to describe accurately. The word the Victorians used was protection. A woman needed to be protected from financial predators, from her own inexperience, from the disorder that, according to prevailing medical and legal opinion, naturally accompanied the female mind when burdened with too much responsibility. This was not considered cruelty, it was considered kindness, and that distinction between cruelty dressed as kindness and kindness that functions as control is the fault line running through every story we are about to tell. Something was already wrong. It had been wrong for centuries, but in the Victorian era, that wrongness was dressed in its finest clothes and presented to the world as progress. Consider a girl. Call her Eleanor, though she could have had 100 different names, because her story was not exceptional. It was the rule. Eleanor was born in the 1850s into a family whose wealth came from land. Thousands of acres in the English countryside, leased to tenant farmers whose rents had sustained 3 generations of comfort. Her father was a man of quiet authority, respected in the county, deferential to no one. Her mother managed the household with the precision of a military operation, overseeing servants, menus, guest lists, and social obligations, with a cheerfulness that never once revealed how little choice she had in any of it. Eleanor grew up understanding on some instinctive level that she was valuable. Not as a person. That distinction would come later. And for many women, it never came at all, but as an asset. She was the daughter of a prosperous family. She would bring land and capital into a marriage. She would consolidate alliances between families whose names appeared on the same county maps. She was, in the most precise economic sense, a transaction waiting to happen. Her education reflected this purpose exactly. She learned French, because French was elegant. She learned to play the pianoforte because music demonstrated refinement. She learned watercolor because art showed sensitivity without ambition. She learned to manage a household budget, barely, because a wife who couldn't run a kitchen was considered a liability. What she did not learn, contract law, property rights, investment, the structure of the trusts that controlled her inheritance, or the name of a single solicitor she could contact independently without mail authorization. That knowledge was not withheld from Eleanor out of malice. It was withheld because it was considered unnecessary. She would have a husband for all of that. But something in Eleanor noticed things. The way her father's land agent spoke over her mother during estate meetings. The way her older cousin, a woman of 35 who had chosen not to marry, was spoken of in hushed tones that combined pity with vague disapproval. The way her own allowance, generous by any standard, was controlled down to the last shilling by a trustee she had met exactly twice, a man named Whitmore, who smelled of tobacco and never once made eye contact with her. She was 15 years old, and already, without being able to articulate it precisely, she understood that the world she had been born into required her to be beautiful, agreeable, and silent about everything that mattered. The year Eleanor turned 18, the introductions began. In Victorian high society, the introduction of a wealthy daughter into the marriage market was conducted with the same strategic precision as a military campaign. The season, that extended period of balls, dinners, garden parties, and theatrical performances that consumed London from spring through midsummer, existed for exactly one purpose, despite the elaborate social decorations placed around it. It existed to match daughters to husbands, and for an heiress the stakes were higher than for anyone else in the room. Eleanor was not naive. She had watched the process happen to girls she knew, had seen how the machinery worked, the formal calls, the carefully engineered introductions, the chaperones stationed at precise distances, the mothers comparing family trees across ballroom floors while pretending to discuss the weather. She had read enough to know that in the previous generation, women had sometimes been married at 14, to men 3 times their age, because a father's debt required rapid liquidation. Those practices had softened somewhat by the 1870s, but the underlying logic had not changed at all. The men who came to meet Eleanor were not in the main romantic figures. They were calculated presences. Some were genuinely wealthy themselves and sought her land to expand their own holdings. Others were aristocratic names attached to depleted fortunes. Men whose titles were real but whose estates had been slowly consumed by bad harvests, failed investments, or the simple mathematics of inherited debt. For these men, Eleanor's inheritance was not a bonus, it was a rescue operation, and they presented themselves with the practiced warmth of someone who needed something desperately, but had been taught that desperation was vulgar. Eleanor's father reviewed these men with the thoroughness of a banker examining loan applications. References were sought. Solicitors communicated through intermediaries. The amounts were discussed, her dowry, the settlement, the jointure that would provide for her if she were widowed. With the same detachment one might apply to the purchase of livestock. Eleanor herself was consulted on her preferences, in the way one might consult a passenger about a route they have no power to alter. She chose eventually. Or rather, she accepted. His name was Charles Alderton, younger son of a baronet, pleasant-looking, educated at Oxford, and in possession of a charm that was genuine enough on the surface to make the transaction feel almost voluntary. The wedding was held in September. The church was full. The light through the windows was golden. Eleanor wore a dress that had taken 4 months to make. The moment the ceremony ended, she ceased to exist as a legal person. That sentence requires sitting with for a moment, because its implications were not metaphorical. Under the doctrine of coverture, the legal principle that had governed English marriage law for centuries and remained largely intact until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a wife's legal identity was completely absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not own property, even property she had brought into the marriage herself. Her jewelry, her inheritance, her dowry, her trust funds, all of it became his, to manage, to spend, to mortgage, to give away, or to simply neglect as he saw fit. Eleanor discovered this reality not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, methodical dismantling. First, the small things. Charles made decisions about the house, their house. She had thought, without consulting her. Staff were dismissed, rooms were redecorated, dinner guests were invited and turned away, all without a word. When she raised the matter of the tenant rents from her father's estate, the land she had grown up on, the income that had funded her entire childhood, Charles explained patiently that those decisions now rested with him and his solicitor. He was not cruel about it. He was simply matter-of-fact, the way one might explain to a child why they cannot touch something valuable. The tone was the worst part. It assumed that Eleanor had always known this was coming and had simply needed a moment to adjust. But something had shifted in her that no one had accounted for. She began to ask questions, careful, precise questions, to the household steward, to her mother, to the few women in her social circle who were old enough to have stopped performing contentment. What she learned, piece by piece, was not a conspiracy. It was something more suffocating than a conspiracy. It was a system so normalized, so thoroughly embedded in the law, the church, the drawing room and the dinner table, that no individual had designed it and no individual needed to maintain it. It maintained itself. It was the air that Victorian England breathed. Before we go further, if this story is already making you question what we call protection and who it actually protects, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Do you think Eleanor ever found a way out? Or was the system simply too complete to escape? The years that followed Eleanor's marriage had a surface of perfect respectability and an interior that grew slowly darker. Not through violence, Charles Alderton was not a violent man. Not through obvious scandal. He maintained in public the appearance of a devoted husband. The darkness came through something far more difficult to name. The systematic erasure of a person who was still in every visible way present. Charles was not a careful steward. This became apparent within 2 years of the marriage, when Eleanor noticed that the rental income from her father's estate, income she could observe but not control, was no longer being reinvested in the land's maintenance. Fields were not being drained properly. Farmhouses that required repair went unrepaired. Tenants who had worked the land for decades began to leave. When she raised this with Charles, he explained that capital had been redirected into a railway investment that would, within 18 months, return the entire amount threefold. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment. The railway investment failed. Not partially, completely. The company dissolved, the shares became worthless, and the money that had been drawn from Eleanor's estate was simply gone. Charles accepted this with the equanimity of a man who has lost something that was never entirely his to value. He moved forward. He found other investments. He made other decisions. The estate continued to deteriorate. Eleanor watched this with the peculiar paralysis of someone who understands exactly what is happening and possesses no legal mechanism to intervene. She had no access to her own solicitor without Charles's awareness. She could not write to her father's trustees directly. Those communications were routed through her husband's household. She could not threaten legal action because the law did not recognize her standing to bring it. Every corridor she tried to walk down led to the same wall. The wall of coverture, smooth and cold and perfectly legal. She was not the only woman in this situation. She was not even unusual. Across England, in houses of every size, women of property were watching their inheritances mismanaged and quietly consumed by men who held those assets not because they were competent, but because the law said they were male. The estates shrank, the fortunes diminished, the women remained, still present, still well-dressed, still performing the elaborate daily theatre of Victorian domesticity, while everything they had been born to slowly disappeared around them. And then, in 1882, Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act. It arrived not as a revolution, but as a correction, small, procedural, and decades overdue. It stated in dry legal language that a woman married after that date could retain ownership of property she held at the time of marriage. It was a profound change. It was also, for women like Eleanor, almost entirely too late. By 1882, Eleanor's children were grown. Her father's estate was a fraction of what it had been. The land that had once sustained generations was mortgaged, sold in parcels, or left to a slow agricultural decline that no Act of Parliament could reverse. The railway money was gone. The tenant farmers were gone. What remained was a reduced household in a house that felt too large, a husband whose confidence in his own judgment had never once wavered despite 20 years of evidence to the contrary, and a woman of middle age who had spent her entire adult life watching the law treat her disappearance as a form of courtesy. Eleanor did not leave, not because she couldn't. By the 1880s, divorce was technically possible, though socially catastrophic. She stayed because the calculation had always been the same. Leaving meant surrendering. Surrendering the house, the social standing, the last threads of connection to the world she had known. It meant being whispered about in the same drawing rooms where she had once been admired. It meant becoming, in the language of Victorian England, a cautionary tale. She became one anyway, not through scandal, but through silence. Eleanor grew quieter in her final decades, precise, watchful, extraordinarily well-read in ways that surprised younger women who visited the house and found a library full of annotated books on property law, women's suffrage, and the parliamentary debates surrounding the 1882 Act. She had read all of it. She had understood all of it. She had simply arrived 20 years too late to use any of it. She died in 1903, 2 years after the Queen, whose era had defined every parameter of her existence. Her obituary in the local paper described her as a devoted wife, a gracious hostess, and a pillar of the community. It mentioned her father's estate in passing as part of her background. It did not mention what had happened to it. It did not mention the railway investment or the trustees, or the 30 years of legal silence. In one room of the house she had lived in for most of her adult life, there was a writing desk that had belonged to her mother. It was a small, elegant piece, dark wood, brass fittings, a surface barely large enough for a single sheet of paper. In the top drawer, wrapped in cloth, her children found a letter she had written sometime in the 1890s and never sent. It was addressed to no one. It described in calm and meticulous detail everything she had understood about the system she had lived inside, how it worked, how it sustained itself, how it had consumed her fortune and her agency while presenting both acts as forms of care. The letter was never published. The desk was eventually sold at auction, and the fields that had once defined her family's place in the world grew back into scrubland, as if the land itself had decided to forget. That desk sat in a house that no longer bears her name. Those fields are now a housing development. The law that had governed her entire existence was eventually, over the course of the 20th century, dismantled piece by piece, not because the system collapsed under its own weight, but because enough women, generation after generation, refused to stop asking the question Eleanor had spent her life asking in private. What you couldn't handle, in the end, was not the corset, not the etiquette, not even the arranged marriage. What you couldn't handle was the silence required of someone who understood exactly what was being done to them and had no language the law would recognize to say so.